Oh, hello, I'm Fairy Armor, and welcome to my first time doing this speed paint thing. You might know me from various platforms, you might not know me at all, but it's great to see you here no matter what. Later on my channel, there may be videos on specific topics or just talks about what I'm up to, but my process feels like a good place to start for right now. As you saw right at the beginning, I started with some thumbnails in my sketchbook. Truth be told, I use my sketchbook a lot less than I feel like I should, since I only really draw there when I already have an idea rather than for explorations. It's much easier to do fast thumbnails on paper for me, but to just have fun or even do studies, I turn to digital first. I've had the same sketchbook for about 3 years now, and it's a little bit of a problem, to be honest. Once those were done, I did a couple of sketches based off of them, and the one I found myself starting to put too much work into and also felt it was the one I wanted to see finished the most, that's the one I decided to go with. Not shown is me flickering through the 3 options, making that decision, as well as the whole page of working out what their outfits will be, just so I already have it set when I get to it here. And if you notice that the far eye is a little too small, don't worry about it, I fix it later. Something that you may be wondering about though is that for the hair and the pattern on the sun's dress, I started them by making a shape with color as a base for what I drew. It's a lot easier sometimes to refine off a silhouette that looks good than making it all up by line when the shape is something freeform like hair, or if I'm experimenting on what to put somewhere. You may be wondering why I've put so much detail into the dress of the sun that's going to be hidden behind the moon's body. The reason for this is that at the time I had thought that I would also show an image of them separately from one another, but that was before I did all of the shading on one layer. Sometimes it makes it faster to minimize the amount of layers you're working in for something, but this wasn't one of those cases, and it's something that you don't know until you get to it. Here I realized that my sketch didn't have the same forearm thicknesses, so I warped the line art and then redrew it, and I'm also doing the same thing for the fringe here. The reason for this is that the program I use, Autodesk Sketchbook, heavily distorts textured lines and fuzzes them out when they're manipulated, so unless I'm also shrinking the lines as I move them, it's better for the line quality to just do them anew. It's really annoying sometimes, and something I had to get used to when I transferred over from Sai and Photoshop, which don't do this quite so badly. Upside is that it's forced me to stay considerate of my initial strokes, like you have to be when working traditionally, which I feel has made me always keep form in mind. That said, the ear I shrunk down just the littlest bit to avoid having to draw it a 4th time. There's some things that it's worth drawing a dozen times to get right, and a half-covered ear is not one of those. Her headpiece is another place I should have stepped away. I did all of the sketches and line art in one day, almost in one sitting, and it was starting to wear me out by the time I got here, but I really wanted to finish the line art tonight. If I'd been smart, I would have taken how much I struggled to decide to stop for the evening altogether, but no. I did at least take it as a sign to leave that area of the illustration for the moment and return to it later when I could be more objective. Here is another part I really should have not put in as much work as I did. Absolutely none of the skirt is really visible in the final except for the edges, so all of these folds that I'm refining right here are pointless. Coming right off of that though, there's the moon's face, and this was maybe one of my favorite parts of working on this entire piece. Through every step of the process, sketching, lining, shading later on too, she looks so serene, and it's really satisfying to be able to create the exact image that you intend to. And it's also funny to look back on a recording of your work and see that, for example, the first nose that I drew was actually not so bad as I thought it was at the moment, but because I had sat working for so many hours, I was a lot more critical than I really needed to be of any little thing at that point. Her dress gave me trouble by then too, because when sketching I decided to leave it up to my later self, which works sometimes, but not when you've already been on line art for 4 hours. Yeah, it took me a hot minute to get through here, and I wanted the fabric to be chiffon or tulle or something light like that and scrunched up, but I don't know how well I really managed to accomplish that. All of this goes to say that sometimes you can push through to get something done. Other times it really is not going to help you and it's just going to make you more frustrated, and it's okay to step away from your work for 15 minutes, half an hour, clear your head, or actually go to sleep because it's around 1 in the morning and you really shouldn't be doing this to yourself, but no, I don't think I will ever learn. Please don't be me. Getting to the roses though, I skipped to the point where they'd all been drawn because for one thing, I didn't record that footage. Bringing them to the point where I was satisfied with them took most of a day, honestly, and here you thought 4 hours on the characters was absurd. The line art on the Celestials was fun, but then the roses I knew were going to be more tedious, with refining the shapes, redrawing, moving and rotating them just slightly, redrawing them again. I didn't think it would be particularly interesting to watch all of those tiny adjustments, and I didn't want to stress myself out mentally by being recorded while I was struggling with them, so I just didn't hit record. That brief flicker of orange that might have surprised you just before I started to manually fill the flowers in, that was me trying to do the inverse selection trick. But it didn't work like it had for the foreground roses before I started the recording because a lot of these roses in the back I didn't do as carefully, not bothering to make sure all of the lines closed so that the trick was actually viable. I decided I had to be faster to just do it all individually because then I could refine the edges of the other selections at the same time. These other selections not being visible to you right now, unfortunately, because the built-in recording function of this software doesn't show the area of selection. They're there, I promise. Now that all of those selections are being finished up and just put onto various layers for quick coloring and being refined, we can finally get to the best part of doing art, in my opinion, the coloring. I did have a bit of a hard time with this one because I wanted the overall feel of the piece to be warm and loving, but I also wanted the colors to be harmonious, and when you're working with yellow and blue, that can be pretty difficult. I dabbled in a few different ways to make the love feeling work, making them warm and cool shades of pink, generating some palettes, giving them human-like skin tones to be more people inspired by the celestial bodies than magical beings themselves, and in trying to make the visual color be blue-ish while the local color was actually a lot warmer than that by putting it under a warm shadow. None of these would have made a bad piece, but none of them were the piece that I wanted to make. And things actually started coming together when I stopped worrying about how to make both of them work with the background I picked first, and thought more about how to make the background make the characters be harmonious together. This is when the sunrise concept for the illustration actually happened. A gradient sky, and also making the roses be warm and cool through darkening the stems. Right here is where my process differs a little from my usual. I started with doing the shading, which I do often do with a bright color on full opacity like this to see what I'm doing before putting it on multiply and knocking it down a ton. And very often making it a bright saturated purple because that works on a lot of different colors. If I'm doing a digital painting instead of an illustration, I pick my shading colors manually, but when doing it like this, purple is a very good color on a lot of other colors. It's cool where it needs to be and it's warm where it needs to be. But I might also be biased because it's my favorite color and it just finds its way into my art all of the time. But this isn't about calling myself out. It's about explaining what the heck I'm doing right now, and what you see is that I shade with a mixture of my textured pencil and my rough brush. The pencil making the transition a little less rough, but still textured. Who'da thunk? It's not the fastest method by any means to build it back and forth in a texture like that, but I love the look of it. When I want an even softer transition, I employ the spray can tool as a soft edge brush for a gradient that builds an opacity like you've already seen. Oftentimes I'll block in an area that I know I want shaded and I'll refine it like I've been doing on the sun. But I also have another method I've been using here on the moon where I set a sort of guide layer to see how much I can cover with shadow without sacrificing form. This allows me to not be precious about what takes a shadow, and it gives me an idea of what it's going to look like if I do it that way, when I don't have to put time into doing it neatly and then decide that I actually want to see what it's like from a different angle for what kind of emotion that would evoke. I don't always know what it is that I want the piece to be at the end, and it just comes up with itself as I work on it. This time it was easy because from the way that I positioned the two characters, I knew right at the get-go I wanted to go from a top left light source like I drew for myself with that little arrow. In a bit there's going to be a lot of flickering for just a second or two, and I'll start explaining those now since there was no layers to see what it is that I'm toggling. I made a layer of yellow going from full to 0 opacity starting in the top left and set it to overlay, testing screen for a moment and then adjusting the strength of it in order to make the light source even more apparent, and right there, that was it. You saw me doing it earlier too, but I didn't like how that one looked anymore, so I simply redid it now. Then there's a layer of blue in the same valley transition going from the bottom right set on a low multiply to add coolness into the shadows. And lastly, a very faint pink overlay to just slightly tweak the blue and the yellow closer to one another. Okay, that was a lot, and now we're a little bit behind. While I was explaining all of that, on screen what I was doing was the stuff that I usually do before my shading, which is putting gradients into the flats. I do this both for depth, like on the clothing where they're further away from the light source, and for areas where there is more blood near the surface of the skin, like hands and cheeks. I also do it because I think blushing is cute and I will not accept any words otherwise. So you've seen me adding on the moon's jewelry with white, and I'm doing this because I decided at the beginning that it would be more star-like and magical if it were completely lineless than to have a dark line wrapped around it. And because she's all prettied up, it's only fair the sun gets some shiny bits too. A nice little hack for gold is the little gradient that I've done with one light spot if it's an area thin enough to have no reflection in it. If I were being more realistic, I would have also bounced some of the moon's blue into it, but I wanted their colors to stay distinct from one another. Now, I've already started putting in some highlights. Originally, I was doing them in a dark color so I could see where I was putting them, but then I quickly swapped to a different hue because highlights in a dark color are a little harder for the brain to make sense of. These I set to a screen layer or an overlay layer depending what looks better from piece to piece. The last part of my process is that I set my line work onto a multiply layer and have it as a warm hue so that it mingles with the color that's underneath it rather than being a stark black. Often I have a duplicate of the line art above that set on a low opacity overlay in an even warmer color to make it closer still to the colors they're on top of, but for this piece I found one layer of line art was enough. And wow, that's everything. Thank you so much for listening this long, and I hope you learned something from me. See you around!